right, so I want to take just a minute here, give you an opportunity for those of you, and I noticed that many of you, most of you did do the week 1 versus ID exercises. I want to give you an opportunity to ask questions if you have them. Let me do this here real quick. Thought I had opened this. Here is the entire list. Since we only had one class meeting last week on Friday where we covered material, there wasn't a whole lot of these. I think in a normal week, yes, sir.
So is the layout for these quizzes going to be where we mostly don't know the terms you're putting up, or are we going to go over them in class mostly? We got to read the books.
These are based on material that we cover in class.
Okay.
Not as it's presented in the textbook. Okay. So, what did I miss? What did I miss?
Oh, your little exchange of books. That was
yeah, the idea here is that we're going to cover material during the course of the week, and then at the end of the week, you're going to get this to kind of help you process that information, make sense out of that information. It does really rely on, I think another benefit of this or another intent of this is to kind of give you an incentive to take good notes during class, because you really can't answer these or shouldn't try to answer these based on information in the textbook or go out and do Google searches or something like that. When you come in to take the unit exams, the multiple choice questions that you see on the unit exams are going to be testing you over these bits of information, these concepts, these theories that we're covering in class, as we talk about them in class, not as the authors of your textbook deal with them, not as any other source out there on the internet might deal with them, as we talk about them in class. So this is just the way that I've tried to come up with to give you some incentive to, as I say, take the notes, pay close attention to what we're talking about in class, take notes, review your notes, and then at the end of the week, try to make sense out of all that by completing these exercises. Okay? Yes, sir. Questions?
So everything we teach in here is going to be on the test?
Well, certainly everything that we teach in this course is subject to being tested on the exam.
But you said that like the book teaches something else and you teach us something.
We take reading quizzes once a week in here that test you over the information in the textbook.
It's going to be from the book or from what you said?
The reading quizzes that we take in here weekly test you over the curriculum that's presented in the textbook.
Okay, so that's what we need to focus on, not what you said.
I didn't say that at all. I don't know what you're hearing, but that's not what I'm saying at all. So be very,
it's going to be on the test.
Listen very carefully.
From what you're saying.
Listen, I'm going to tell you. Okay? You're going to take weekly reading quizzes in here, and they're going to test you over information that's presented in the textbook, or whatever the reading assignment is for that week. We are going to have weekly Monday, Wednesday, Friday class meetings where we're going to cover material, and the information that we discuss, that we present and discuss in those class sessions is tested on the unit exams. Okay? If you've read the course syllabus, and all of you should have read the course syllabus by now, you know that we have several different kinds of course requirements. We have unit exams, we have 4 unit exams, we have a final exam, we have reading quizzes, we have these versus ID exercises. I don't think you're hearing what I'm telling you. Now, let's meet after class and we'll try to sort it out. Okay? All right. Any questions about any of these? Here's the whole list. Oh, what I started to say and then digressed was that there were only 11 items on this one, and you saw 10 of them. So most of you saw the same group of 10 in some order. There's sort of a random order that's generated, so your order of them might not look the same as your order of them, etc. But because there were only 11 of them, most of you got the same thing. But I think as we go by, like for example in week 2, there's likely to be in the whole bank, there's likely to be far more than 11. Okay, there's in fact, for example, in the other government 2305 classes that I have that are presented in a hybrid format, they had like 51 items in their whole first week bank, but they only got like the same, like a handful of them like you did. I think they got like 12. Okay, So I'm going to keep that manageable. The idea here is not, in my mind, is not that these are going to be exhaustive. Like the set of versus ID exercises that you get, that somehow it's going to be exhaustive of everything you need to know for the test. It's really just sort of a way to check to make sure that you're understanding, sort of sampling material. And if you can kind of do well on the set of 10 or 11 or 12 that you get, that's probably a pretty good indication that you're understanding the stuff that we're talking about in class. But you're also going to have the ability at the end of the week, as I said, at 11:59 on Saturday, to come out here if you want. You don't have to, but to get the full set so that you can just sort of make sure, oh yeah, I have that in my notes, or I have that in my notes. Right? That's kind of my idea of how those are going to work. Right? So, all right, one more opportunity here I'll offer you to ask questions if you have them about any of this information that we covered in last Friday's class session. Yes, sir?
So you said that the bank is just going to continue to get bigger and bigger.
The what?
The
Oh, you're talking about this list of terms up here at the top? That's, of course, a longer list of terms than you actually use in the assignment or in the exercise, right? They're what I guess people who make out these kind of assignments call foils. Some of them never appear, right, in any of the answers. And the reason for that is I'm trying to get you to think a little bit. I don't want these things to be so obvious, right, that this is really intended to be sort of a thinking opportunity. So, I mean, if it's so obvious, there's really not much benefit to it, I believe. So I want you to have to make choices, like, oh, is he talking there about the concept of legitimacy, or is he talking about the concept of, you know whatever else, that consent of the governor, or whatever else might be relevant there. So, as you look at that entire list of terms, when you're doing these exercises, you kind of have to, as I say, do a little bit of thinking about what the best answer is that goes in there. Okay, well, if there are no other questions, I want to move on and develop our discussion a little bit more. This is the definition of politics that we sort of settled on. Actually, I introduced you to 3 definitions of politics in the class session last Friday. And I told you that the Laswell definition is easy to remember, the Easton definition is easy to remember, but they kind of are wanting or lacking in the sense that we need explanation of the definition. And this definition, I don't think, is by a perfect definition by any stretch of the imagination, but it does say some things explicitly that you can only infer from the Laswell and Easton's definition. And that's the business about politics being a competitive process, because the things that we value in society, that members of society value, are scarce. They're not abundant. They're not infinite, right? They're scarce. That means people are in conflict over those scarce resources. And so the society has to have some process for determining who gets them, when they get them, and how they get them, how to allocate those scarce resources. And as a result of how the society allocates those scarce resources, it says something about the priorities that the society has. And so we talked about those ideas a little bit last time, the idea that there are relative winners and losers. All of that we can sort of glean from just that definition of politics, right? Which I think gets us a pretty good start, right? And then I gave you a definition of government as well. I don't have that handy. I'm not going to try to pull that up. It's the structured arrangements in a society that produces decisions resolving conflicts over scarce resources. And the deliberate attempt by defining government in that fashion is to help you sort of draw the connection between politics and government. Your intuition tells you that there's a connection between politics and government. You know what happens in Washington in the government is political in its nature. That's not a shock to anybody in here. Even if you think you don't really know anything about politics, even if you think you don't have much understanding of what happens in our government, you at least know that what happens is political, right? So we know that there's that connection between politics and government. But I cautioned you last time that politics is really a broader concept, right? kind of activities, the kinds of behaviors that occur in government institutions are political, but there are political behaviors and activities that occur in non-governmental institutions as well. Okay? And we'll talk about some of those this semester. I hinted in the last class meeting about, we have a topic, for example, this semester on political parties. That's not government. We have a topic on interest groups. That's not government. Okay? We have a number of topics like that. Okay? In fact, specifically our treatment of government in this class, our examination of government institutions, doesn't really occur until the very end of the semester, when we have topics on Congress as an institution, and the presidency as an institution, and the courts and bureaucracies. Okay? Down around week 11 or 12, something like that, I think. So most of this class is really designed to deal with the aspects of the American political system that are external to government. Okay? Anyway, so I was hoping with that definition of government we would kind of see the connection between politics and government. Okay? And I sort of left you with the question last time, why do people in at least American political society view government as legitimate? Why do people pay their taxes? Why do people obey the speed limit or whatever other regulations governments impose and the United States governments impose on them? And we were sort of talking about the idea that, well, if we don't, we'll be punished. And then I said, well, that just sort of shifts the burden, because the next question that I want to pose to you is, well, why do you accept the punishment? Why do you think that government has the authority to punish you? And really, I think the simple, just so we can move on to new stuff, I think the simple answer to that is, whether we've thought it through very carefully or not, we sort of have grown up being trained up to believe that whatever authority government has comes from us in the first place. We might not like how much government taxes us. We might not like how much government regulates us, or the specific instance of the regulation in this instance or that instance. But ultimately, we kind of have this idea that the authority of government comes from us. It's embodied in those three little words that open the preamble of the Constitution, right? We the people. Exactly. There you go. We the people of the United States. In order to form a more perfect union, establish justice, domestic tranquility, provide for the common defense. For all these purposes that we have, we do ordain and establish this government and give the government this authority to make these kinds of binding decisions in our lives. There are very few people, as much as they might complain, very few people in American society, as much as they might complain about paying taxes or how much government regulates them, that really fundamentally question the authority of government to govern over them. If, they're part of some militia or something out in, some remote area of North Dakota or Utah or someplace like that, maybe so, but most people aren't that sort of that. Okay, so let's move on. I want to talk a little bit about what I like to refer to as the politics of ideas. We know that politics is a competitive process, and it has to do with the allocation of scarce resources. I want to build on that some by talking a little bit about the politics of ideas. And I want to define the politics of ideas as the process whereby ideas or sets of ideas compete with one another to achieve prominence in a society. The politics of ideas is the process whereby ideas or sets of ideas compete with one another in order to achieve prominence in a society. Governmental institutions and processes, broad public policy agendas, specific policies and programs then are subsequently based on the idea or the ideas that have come to predominate. So you have all these different ideas out there, or sets of ideas out there that are in competition with one another. Right? And ultimately, maybe as a result of a specific process, like say an election, one set of ideas comes to a position of prominence. If there's a set of ideas, for example, that we could label Trumpism, imagine that there's some set of ideas out there that we can label Trumpism. Then Trump, the person, Donald Trump, is elected president. Would we not expect for the president's policy agenda to reflect the ideas of Trumpism, and there would be some effort, whether it's sort of broad philosophical ideas or specific ideas, like say broad ideas like deregulation, or even specific ideas like building a border wall. Wouldn't we expect, to the extent that that has come to a position of prominence, that the president in his official capacity would attempt to move a policy agenda based on those ideas? Okay? Sure, that makes sense, right? So initially here, we understand that there's all these ideas out there in the political arena that are competing with one another, and somehow a set of ideas, or even specific ideas, come to a position of prominence, and that has consequences in terms of what government actually does. Okay? Sometimes in the politics of ideas, the idea or the set of ideas are relatively short-lived. Consider as an example prohibition in the early part of the 20th century, about 100 years ago. You had, in a relatively short period of time, an idea come. Now, it had deeper roots. Some of you may know that the prohibition of transport and sale of alcoholic beverages in the United States actually had its origins back in the 19th century during the women's temperance movement, right? But ultimately, this constitutional amendment effort comes along in the early part of the 20th century. The Constitution is amended to prohibit the sale and transport of alcoholic beverages in the United States. But just a few years later, that idea has faded from prominence. In fact, the repeal comes very quickly in a second or subsequent constitutional amendment. So that happens sometimes. Sometimes an idea comes to a position of prominence, and then almost as quickly, it would seem, it sort of fades away. Other ideas have greater permanence. Consider the idea of Republican form of government. Republican form of government rose to prominence during a period of Western history that we're going to talk in some detail about in just a couple of class meetings down the road. It's the period that the historians refer to as the Age of Enlightenment, which is primarily the 18th century, the 1700s. So again, we'll talk about that in a lot more detail because it's very important for us. During the Age of Enlightenment, political thinkers, political philosophers, people who espouse political ideas began to argue that Republican government was preferable to the form of government that Westerners had been accustomed to for a couple of millennia up to that point. The other major form of government in the world historically, monarchy. Europeans, for example, had lived up until that time in monarchical systems with a king or a queen. But beginning the Age of Enlightenment, philosophers began reflecting, oh, maybe there's a better way to structure and organize government rather than on the basis of having a hereditary monarch. And of course, the Americans in 1776 were the first to establish, when they declared their independence from Britain and established the United States, were the first modern nation to establish a permanent Republican form of government. But through the 19th century, the idea of republicanism caught fire, right? And by the time you get to the end of the 19th century, by the time you get to the turn of the 20th century, most of the European nation states, and certainly all of the countries of North and South America, of the Americas, and many of the countries of Asia, and really all around the world, had transformed from monarchical arrangements to republican systems. So we've been sort of living in a world in the 20th century and now into the 21st century that is quite well entrenched in the idea of republicanism. Not all Republican governments look exactly the same or operate the same. In fact, there can be quite significant differences. But most countries in the world today do not have a king or a queen.
except like as a figurehead, I suppose.
Well, if we wanted to get into some discussion, we can talk about the fact that there are different types of monarchies, right? Maybe one broad distinction that we can make would be between what we might call a genuine monarchy, like, say, Saudi Arabia, where the king, the royal family generally really is the sovereign. That word sovereign means the ultimate source of political authority. Okay? So Saudi Arabia would be an example. I'm certainly not an expert on Saudi Arabia, but I think I understand enough to know that in Saudi Arabia, the king is the sovereign. Okay? And there are some implications there for democracy or lack thereof of democracy in Saudi Arabia and rights of individuals and so on. You all know that if you pay any attention at all to the news, right? On the other hand, you have a country like, say, Great Britain or Sweden or even Japan, where you have a monarch, but it's what we call a constitutional monarch, and where they may still, for example, in Great Britain, just rhetorically refer to the Queen as the sovereign, but the Queen really is not the sovereign. The ultimate political authority in Great Britain, just like in the United States, is the people through their elected representatives in the House of Commons. Okay? So we can make those kinds of distinctions as we go along. Okay? We'll have some time, I think, to do that. Okay? So we've got some ideas that are relatively short-lived. We've got some ideas that are longer-lived. We have some ideas that are motivated principally by economic interests. And I have up there as an example labor laws. But that's certainly not the only example that we could come up with. I think, for example, the arguments that people make, the ideas that people have about tax policy. Some people advocate progressive income taxation. Some people advocate a flat tax concept. Some people advocate a national sales tax, like getting rid of the federal income tax altogether and having a national sales tax. Right? So we have all these ideas circulating out there about policy, tax policy, and for about the last 100 years, the predominant idea has been a progressive income tax concept. How do I know that? How do I know that for the last 100 years, the predominant idea with respect to tax policy at the national level has been a progressive income tax, rather than, say, a flat tax, or what economists call a head tax, or ad valorem taxation, or some other set of, national sales tax or something like that. How do I know that? Well, because we have a progressive income tax. We're in tax season now, and many of you are going to be filing your W-4 form here in the next few weeks or whatever, and you know that you're, what's the basic concept behind a progressive tax? We don't have to get into all the details of what's involved in the federal tax code, but what's the basic idea behind a progressive income tax? The more you make, the more you pay. Right? So that's an idea that came to prominence about 100 years ago, that we're going to have a tax system in this country where, broadly speaking, the more you make, the more you pay. And it's had all kinds of modifications over the years, changes and so on, but that's still basically the idea that is predominant. Okay? Sometimes ideas are advanced principally on moral grounds. I think a very obvious example of that in the 19th century was the abolitionist movement, those who were advocating the end of slavery as an institution, the ownership of human beings as chattel. Clearly, there's a moral imperative behind that argument. Oftentimes, though, ideas that are really motivated by economic interests are couched in moral language. I think for a good chunk of the last 60 or 70 years in this country, maybe even longer, the debate over what most people call welfare policy has worked like that to a very large extent, particularly people who want to restrict welfare benefits, people who want to place severe limitations on those who are eligible for welfare benefits have a tendency to make their arguments in moral language. They'll say things like, the reason we want to limit welfare benefits and not let people have welfare benefits for too long is because they'll become dependent upon them, and that deprives them of the dignity of hard work and self-reliance. And I'm not suggesting to you that that's not a genuinely believed argument, but I think we have the ability in the political arena to oftentimes couch our true motivations in those kinds of terms. I think for many people it may just be that they don't like the idea of their tax money going to pay for people who don't support themselves. And it's really kind of motivated largely by economic self-interest. So I guess the point I'm trying to make to you is that the politics of ideas can take many different forms, okay? But broadly speaking, what we have out there are all these ideas that are in competition with one another, and there's a connection between those ideas when they come to prominence and what government actually does as a matter of policy agenda. Okay, now having said that, I want to talk a little bit very broadly about ideas and how they inform the creation of the American political system, how it was structured, and how it operates really to this day. Okay? So we're going to talk a little bit about some basic ideological assumptions. And I want to begin by suggesting to you what the assumptions are of a particular ideology known as liberalism. Okay? Actually, before you get too busy writing, I know that this can get frustrating. Let me take this off just so that you don't get distracted. Right? I should have done this first. Right? We're going to talk here for the next little bit about the role of ideology. Ideologies are systems of political thought, or systems of ideas. And any ideology, whether it is liberalism, what I call classical liberalism, or classical conservatism, or communism, or fascism, or any other ism, right? That suffix ism, when you see it on the end of a word, often denotes a system of thought. We're particularly interested here in systems of political thought, but it is also true in other areas of thought, like, say, economics, capitalism, mercantilism, socialism, corporatism, right? In areas of sort of social thought, like, say, feminism, or in areas of religious thought, like Catholicism or Judaism, right? So anytime you see that, not always, but oftentimes when you see that suffix ism on the end of a word, it's indicating a system of thought. As I say, we're mainly interested in this class in systems of political thought, but from time to time we deal with some of the others as well. Okay? So any ideology, an ideology, an ism, is a system of thought that ultimately comes down to two considerations, right? About the purposes and scope of government. Why do we have government? Every ideology essentially poses that question. Why do we have government? And secondly, how much authority should government have to fulfill that purpose? Okay? So, classical liberalism reaches some conclusions about why we have government and how much authority government should have. Classical conservatism reaches some conclusions about why we have government and how much authority government should have. And by the way, those terms, liberal, just a little bit of forewarning here. Those two terms, liberalism and conservatism, are tossed around a lot in American politics today. I am using the terms, I keep putting that word classical in front of them because I'm trying to indicate to you that I'm using these terms from this point for the next little while anyway, in a way that's not commonly used in the popular political debate discourse. Right? In fact, the way that the media people politicians themselves or political pundits that you might bloggers and so on. The way that they use those terms liberal and conservative in American politics, they've become largely meaningless, I think. Right? So classical liberalism reaches some conclusions about why we have government and how much authority government should have. Classical conservatism, communism, fascism, all of these systems, anarchism, all of these systems of political thought ultimately come down to that. But before any of them can reach any conclusions about why we have government and how much authority government should have, they make some preliminary assumptions about human beings and society. Right? Specifically with respect to human beings, they make some assumptions about human nature. Why do human beings behave in the way that they do? What motivates them? About society, what are the social arrangements in any given society like? Is there a class system? There are all sorts of questions that are posed that have to be dealt with before the ideology can actually address the question about why we have government, how much authority government should have. So I want to just sort of run through with you a couple of alternatives here. Okay, starting with classical liberalism. And I'm going to argue that classical liberalism is really the dominant ideology in American political life. Classical liberalism historically has been the dominant ideology in American political life. I think that's true at least through our national history, going back to the founding of the Republic in 1776. But a strong argument can be made going back into the colonial period as well. Classical liberalism is the dominant system of political thought. It's the dominant ideology. And again, if you're thinking to yourself, hold on, Fagin, how dare you? I'm a conservative. How dare you? I know better. Most Americans are conservative. I'm not using the term liberal like you think, or like the media people use it, or the pundits use it, or the politicians use it. Liberalism as a system of political thought, as an ideology, has been the ideology that advances the rights and liberties of individuals. Notice the common root between the word liberty and liberal. And what could be more American than the concept of liberty? It's the founding principle. You know that, to my knowledge, I'm certainly no historian, but I think I'm on the right track here. The United States of America, when it was founded in 1776, was the first nation founded on the basis of an idea. You think about human history. Nations have usually been founded either on the basis of a common race or ethnicity or a common language. The Americans come along in 1776 and form a nation on the basis of an idea. That idea is liberty. It is the founding principle. And to a large extent, over the last 200 plus years, most Americans have accepted that as the organizing principle of our society, regardless of race or ethnicity, regardless of national origin, regardless of income level, regardless of level of educational achievement, regardless of religious background, regardless of any of the demographic factors that you might want to throw out there. The United States, American society is certainly a diverse society. I mean, it is the essence of pluralism, right? Diversity. That Latin phrase, e pluribus unum, what does that mean? Who knows what that means? From many one, e pluribus unum, from many, what? What was that? Well, thank you, I appreciate that. E pluribus unum from many one is the suggestion that American society, we have lots of differences. There are so many differences among Americans, as I say, any way you want to slice it up. But we're one people. On what basis are we one people? Oh, this concept of liberty. Okay. What could be more American? As immortal words of Patrick Henry, give me liberty or give me death. So, when I use the term liberal here in this discussion, I want you to understand that that's the system of thought I'm talking about. I'm not talking about a Hillary Clinton liberal or a Bernie Sanders liberal or something like that. In fact, all of that on both sides of the political aisle, so to speak, liberal, as we call liberals and conservatives in American politics, really sort of accept that basic organizing concept of American society. Okay, so what are the assumptions that liberalism makes about human beings? Liberals assume that human beings are rational, self-interested, and acquisitive. What do we mean by rational? What do you think liberalism contemplates when it says that human beings are rational? It does sort of suggest that there's an ability there of the human animal to reason things out. That's pretty good. That's a good start. Anything else?
Common sense.
Maybe. Maybe not. Could. Perhaps.
A majority of people won't act like, for lack of a better word, crazy. Like, out of the blue. They'll have a thought process behind what they're doing.
There may be some implication of that. I think that's not. I think there's some aspect of that there's an implication that most people are going to be, thoughtful and not act on impulse, if that's kind of what you mean by that. But certainly not. That's not the essence of what we mean by rational. Rational is one of those terms in the English language that means different things depending on who's using it in the context. For example, rational in this context that we're talking about means something very different than what a mathematician means by rational. Right? We're opting for really an economic understanding of the concept of rational behavior. Have any of you taken an economics course? Okay. Those of you who've taken an economics course have some sense of what economists mean by rational? There's a lot. It actually has, quite a bit of things that, aspects that we could talk about, but I think one thing that it clearly means is that when individuals are faced with making decisions, they choose there's more, two or more alternatives out there that they have to choose from. They choose the alternative that they believe will bring them the most net benefit. That's what rational means to an economist. Right? That human beings are rational. Their behavior is rational when they make decisions based on a cost-benefit calculus. An economist will tell you that every decision you make, day-to-day decisions, very sort of mundane decisions to very big decisions, are essentially a cost-benefit calculus. When you're trying to decide whether or not to get up to come to Fagan's government class on Monday, Wednesday, Friday in the midday, or maybe stay home and watch some stream some videos on Netflix or something like that, you have to make a decision. You have a couple of alternatives there, and you do a cost-benefit calculus. If you calculate, and oftentimes that cost-benefit sometimes, occasionally, people will actually sit down and sort of lay out all the costs and benefits associated with each alternative, but oftentimes it's done on a snap, right? Which is not the same thing as saying that they're doing it on impulse, right? But sometimes it's just done like that, okay? If you calculate that you will get more benefit out of staying home and lounging around on the sofa and streaming whatever your favorite show is on Netflix versus the benefits that you would get, the net benefits that you would get from coming to Fagan's government class, it would be irrational for you to show up to Fagan's government class. Doesn't that make sense? If you consider buying a soft drink out of the vending machine and you calculate that you're going to get $1.75, or you're going to get $2 worth of benefit of drinking the soft drink, okay? And the price of the soft drink is $1.75. It's rational to do what? To buy the soft drink, right? If you all calculate, however, that you're only going to get $1 worth of benefit, and the price is $1.75, it would be irrational to put $1.75 in the machine and buy the soft drink, right? So whether or not we're aware of it, we're doing a cost-benefit calculus. When you decide what you're going to go have for lunch, oh, I can go to, Torchy's Tacos, have a taco. I can go to the mall, food court. I can go to, whatever your options are out there. You have so many options out there. How many? Let's say you're considering 5 different options, and you decide in the final analysis that you want to go to Subway and have a sandwich, but somehow your car ends up at Torchy's Tacos, and you're sitting at Torchy's Tacos eating tacos, then what does that tell us? What does that tell us about, you may say to yourself, oh, I really want a Subway today, but it's your behavior that tells you what the rational decision was, right? Okay, so the first thing that liberals assume about human nature is that human beings are rational. And that's a very, very important assumption that the founders of our political system make when they create the system of government in the late 18th century. So we'll continue with that on Wednesday.